In this video, I'm going to respond to Richard Tieszen's article, Analytic and Continental Philosophy, Science and Global Philosophy. First, let me offer a distinction between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. So, as a result of Hitler's occupation of continental Europe, the second half of the 20th century saw a division of philosophers into analytic and continental philosophers, with analytic philosophers concentrated in the English-speaking world and continental philosophers concentrated in the countries that Hitler had occupied. Recently, there have been some efforts to overcome the divide, and continental philosophy has become more common in the English-speaking world, and likewise, analytic philosophy has also become more common outside of the English-speaking world. There have also been some bizarre attempts to achieve a synthesis of these two approaches. Now, let's turn our attention to the article, Analytic and Continental Philosophy, Science and Global Philosophy. I'll be providing a link to this article in the description of the video. In this article, Tisane, and I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but I'm just going to keep saying it like that, Tisane considers the relationship of science to philosophy and what analytic and continental philosophers have had to say on the subject. In the abstract preceding his article, Tisane expresses the hope that exchanges between analytic and continental philosophers on the subject of science will help to further foster constructive engagement between the traditions. Now, Tisane begins his article by pointing out that some have sought to understand the difference between analytic and continental philosophy by focusing on the works of leading figures, and of course that is helpful. He then mentions various descriptions of the difference, and actually some of these are quite helpful, although he does deny that any of them as it stands are accurate. And, well, we need to consider the various features that he lists as family resemblance criteria, and not see them as logically necessary conditions for applying the expressions analytic and continental philosophy, respectively. Tisane lists some questions about science which philosophers have raised, and we should take some time to consider them. The first question is natural science to be a model for philosophy? Now, we know that the natural sciences are authoritative disciplines, whereas philosophy is not. Now, anyone who is interested in knowledge should be welcome towards making philosophy, as well as other non-authoritative disciplines, into authoritative disciplines. In that sense, the natural sciences, mathematics, and other authoritative disciplines can serve as models for philosophy. However, philosophy has its own subject matter, which overlaps only partially with the subject matter of a variety of other disciplines, not just the natural sciences. Should philosophers leave the question of the theory of perception, the mind-body problem, the question of the existence of God, and etc. to scientists? Well, no, because philosophers have their own contributions to make, but scientists will construct a theory of perception, or maybe an astronomy theory that excludes gods, and etc., which will enable them to make correct predictions or develop useful technology, and etc., but they will not take time to deal with other people's thinking that may lead them to a different theory of perception, or to a different belief about God. Now, the second question, which Tisane brings our attention to, is the question of whether philosophy is should be a foundation for science. Now, insofar as philosophy is always very ideological or obscurantist, especially in the case of continental philosophy, we can say obviously not. However, logicians and philosophers of science can be very helpful in outlining, clarifying, and justifying scientific methods. Locke saw himself as an underlaborer for science, clearing away ideas that blocked the development of science and promoting ideas such as the ideas of primary and secondary qualities, which facilitated scientific development. But it's good to note here that he was more of a poster boy that was given the role of promoting views that had already been discovered by the British scientific community, and just kind of getting them some popularity in the public that had sort of already just been under the Aristotelian scholastic paradigm. But that's a bit of a digression. The next question that Tisane wants to talk about is Is natural science limited and one-sided as a model for philosophy? Now, natural science has many features, such as being an authoritative discipline and being very rigorous, which make it into a good model. But natural science does not encompass the disciplines of logic and mathematics, though it does use both. And logic and mathematics clearly have a great deal to offer to philosophers. Note, though, that conceptual analysis involves applying the hypothetical deductive method to using our linguistic tendencies, which means that the conceptual analysis involves doing what scientists do when they develop theories. But the use of the hypothetical deductive method is, in any case, used by everyone. Now, does science represent just the sort of regimentation we need in philosophy? This is another question he raises. In some ways, yes, but as we have already noted, philosophers have their own approach to metaphysical issues, and when they deal with concepts and conceptual structures, philosophers are dealing with a different kind of subject matter than that which figures in a chemistry field or a field of physics. Philosophers are not going to establish laboratories or do field work, even though they do use their senses to detect how things work or what conceptual structures exist, and maybe, like, for example, how sticks look like when they are partially immersed in water. So the second last question I'm going to deal with is natural science a condition for the possibility of legitimate philosophy? And to this we can reply certainly not. If natural science had not been developed, philosophers could and would have proposed it. Now, it is easy to specify philosophical questions that could have been asked and answered irrespective of whether natural science ever existed. For example, we could say the questions like, do we have free will, or what does it mean to have knowledge, and etc. Now, the last question I wanted to address that Tisane brings up is philosophy a condition for the possibility of natural science? Again, we can say no. Even though philosophy has been helpful in the development of science, science could have been developed even if the discipline of philosophy had never existed. Science can develop simply once people begin to use logic and apply it to experience. A certain boldness in developing hypothesis and organization as an authoritative discipline are very important in accounting for the impressive development of natural sciences in modern times. Tisane also mentions the fact that natural science has demolished many pretensions of philosophers. Here we are talking about the claims of the universe and etc. that are put forward by rationalist ideologues, and these are claims that they were in no position to justify, which were just ideological in character. So, in other words, they were devised not to be accurate to reality, but just to make people think certain things, to be able to produce certain kinds of behaviors and actions, in other words, to manipulate people. Now, of course, scientists were able to demolish these conceptions by applying logic to experience, although sometimes they were persecuted by doctrinal schools of belief, and one example of that might be when the Roman Catholic Church would execute scientists and astronomers. Tisane allows himself to write like a continental philosopher when he talks about the understanding or knowledge of being, with a capital B, or of non-being, in the natural science. Now, this language contains a categorical mistake. The word being cannot be used to identify a topic of study. Its legitimate use is in sentences like, he is being awkward, or in the marsh there lived a strange being. Whilst a biologist will understand if she is asked for knowledge about the beings that live in the marsh, she will only be puzzled if she is asked about her knowledge of being with a capital B. Now, she would be equally puzzled by the extract from Heidegger that comes next in Tisane's article. Heidegger, incidentally, might be regarded as the father of continental philosophy. As such, he provided the backing of Hitler. He wrote volumes that, like the extract Tieszen provides, are riddled with categorical mistakes. One can dismiss the sentences as meaningless, or one can try to attribute some meaning to them. In the latter case, it is actually the reader, rather than Heidegger, who deserves credit for any valuable thought that emerges. one might as well look at squiggles for inspiration. In reality, devotees of Heidegger usually produce more and more nonsense, which is then paraded as profundity in the realm of academia. And that was the point of Heidegger, was basically to destroy all coherent thought and replace it by enforced reverence for pseudo-profound nonsense, because this is very useful for controlling people by means of propaganda and appealing to emotion and etc. Now, that remained to be the political purpose of much of continental philosophy, if not all, even though not all of it was as extreme as the content of Heidegger's writings. Now, Heidegger's writings are not entirely devoid of content, however. In the extract that Tisane puts before us, we can detect negative attitudes towards science, and a sense of superiority that is claimed for his pseudo-profound studies of nothing. Now, people talking nonsense and basking in a sense of superiority, a perfect recipe for power holders who want to make sure that there are no significant thought occurring in the fields in which nonsense prevails. Hitler used in a more extreme form an approach which was also used with German idealism, which gave rise to the British imitation, against which Russell and Moore rebelled. Now, the state of the humanities in the late 19th century Germany was revoked by Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols in the section called What the Germans Lack. Nietzsche emigrated to Switzerland to continue his academic life there. On the one hand, Heidegger criticizes scientists for ignoring his nonsense, but on the other, he says that science is not even possible unless it engages in such nonsense. A gross inconsistency in Heidegger's thinking. Now, although it is absurd to say that science must be based on metaphysics, if by metaphysics is meant the content of Heidegger's nonsense, it is not so absurd to say the same pronouncement that science needs to be based on metaphysics if metaphysics is understood as a clear-minded description of the fundamental nature of reality. Then there is no fundamental distinction, however, between metaphysics and science, which indeed must identify the basic elements of reality to encompass in its theories. Heidegger tries to convince the reader that metaphysics is superior to science, but all he offers in support is a jumble of categorical errors and flowery language. After quoting Heidegger, Tisane turns his attention to Karin, who, like other logical positivists, denounced Heidegger's work as nonsense. However, the logical positivists were too influenced by the paradigms of science and descriptive language, and tended to reject as meaningless not only the nonsense of Heidegger and the German idealist, but also evaluative language. For example, it is obviously wrong to call sentences like, "this apple is good," meaningless, and doing so only weakens the case made against the continental philosophers, which should rest on analysis of their category mistakes and other misuses of language. Ordinary language philosophers, such as J. L. Austin, did a better job of analyzing the various legitimate uses of language that did exist, and the pitfalls associated with the misuse of language by continental philosophers. Wanting to bridge the gap between continental and analytic philosophy, Tisane draws attention to Gödel's interest in Husserl. Gödel was a logician rather than a philosopher, and his enthusiasm for Husserl is misguided. The word intentional, or intentional with an S, has two uses. There is the intentional use of language, when we use a word to refer to the concept that the word expresses. If we call a thought intentional, it is to indicate that something has a subject matter, that it is about something. To say intentionality in either sense is something non-physical, is to take up a position in the philosophy of mind that is controversial. In practice, there is no basis for saying that we can have a study conducted in the natural, or a study of intentionality that is totally different than the kinds of studies conducted in the natural sciences. Ordinary computers can calculate, but we do not say that they think about anything. We supply the meaning that would change if computers associated their symbols with ranges of camera data as we associated our symbols with ranges of experience, which are in turn associated with brain processes. The question from Quine is also unhelpful. There is no science of intention, but that does not make intentional idioms baseless. The intentional use of language is simply a particular use of language that needs to be acknowledged. Quine is confused when he calls the intentional use of language non-referential. Intentionally used words do refer, but they refer to their intentions rather than their extensions. So, when I say, horses like to eat, I'm talking about the concept of horses, and I'm talking intentionally, rather than saying that horse over there is hungry, where I'm speaking extensionally because I'm referring to a specific extended object. Now, next, Tisane makes some remarks about the scientific study of mind. He mentions neuroscience and behaviorism, two scientific trends that had philosophical counterparts in the mind-brain identity theory and linguistic and metaphysical behaviorism. Neuroscience studies the brain, and scientific behaviorism looks for relationships between behavior and the environment in which it occurs. Philosophers provided ideological support to behaviorism by claiming that mental language is actually about behavior, and or by claiming that our mental life consists in behavior and behavioral disposition. Tisane claims that no scientific approach has been able to handle consciousness properly. Well, we can say that scientific behaviorism simply ignores consciousness. It is interested only in finding the environmental causes of behavior, with a view to influencing behavior. Lack of attention to consciousness has not prevented behaviorists from achieving knowledge that is used to guide people to McDonald's, and in general, behave as desired by those who shape the environment to that end. Neuroscience is enabling us to understand the functioning of the brain more and more, and whether that is also an understanding of consciousness depends on whether the identity theory is true. If it is not, then neuroscience is still delivering genuine and useful knowledge of the brain's functioning. Broadening his inquiry again, Tisane proceeds to discuss some features of modern natural science. He notes that the primary qualities are precisely those that are mathematizable, and a mathematical approach and a focus on primary qualities are characteristic of natural science. However, it is silly of Tisane to say that knowledge is concerned with primary qualities, but opinion and illusion are generally associated with secondary qualities. I can have the illusion that one line is longer than the other, and I can know that carnations have a scent. Tisane associates mathematization with abstraction from the qualities of things, but we can equally well say that if, for example, we say that red objects are present, we are abstracting from the quantity of the objects. Our statements never say everything that there is to say. Tisane also associates mathematization with precision and exactness that is otherwise not available to us. But in fact, we can be precise and exact in non-mathematical thinking as well. Besides mathematics, we have logic. Now, analytic philosophy is often more precise than some science. Tisane is confused when he talks of imprecision being present in our experience. This is a categorical mistake. Idealization is simplification, so in calling a tabletop rectangular, for example, even though it has rounded edges, we are simplifying to permit an easier calculation, and the imprecision is in our thinking rather than in our experience. Tisane also, he begins using continental jargon in the course of talking about the abstraction in science, and he says that quantification, formalization, generalization, variation, and the like are, and I quote, founded on our experiences as a whole, for which he uses the expression, the German word Lebenswelt, and manifest image. Now, this is not really very useful language to be using. While there is each person's total experience, and as well the totality of all organisms' experiences, science does not make use of all of it. A scientist will use those experiences which are relevant to the research being done. No one, whether a scientist or a philosopher, will say everything that there is to be said, and no one will articulate even the whole of his or her own experience. And yet, on the other hand, science will be able to describe a universe which is vastly greater than any set of personal experiences. Tisane says that to abstract features of our experience is not itself to be engaged in experience in the same way that we would be if we were not abstracting. Indeed, knowledge by description is not the same as knowledge by acquaintance. It is in the nature of knowledge by acquaintance that it is limited in scope. Compare experiencing apples with general knowledge of apples. It is pointless to complain that one kind of knowledge is not another kind, and it is not only science that involves knowledge by description. Everyone has always relied on it. It is a practical necessity. To say, as Tisane does, that continental philosophers have pointed out that there can be, and has been, life-world experiences without natural science, is to give credit to continental philosophy where it is not due. Everyone knows that people have experiences which do not depend on the existence of natural science, and using the strange term life world only gives superficial impression of an insignificant insight. Often, with continental philosophy, if anything can be made of what is said, it turns out to be something that we already knew. Now, Tisane's discussion of objectivity on page 13 of the article is confused. Objectivity in authoritative disciplines is all about respecting the evidence, searching for the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and avoiding bias. It is not about favoring the external world over the internal world, and as Tisane has noted, experience plays a crucial role in all of this. Does scientist A have the same experiences as scientist B when he repeats an experiment? It is nonsense to talk of the scientist involving us in a higher degree of objectification of the world. Long before there was science, we had the idea of a common world in which we live. Nor does this involve ignoring private experiences. For example, scientists can talk objectively about pains or the difference between a pseudonormal observer's experience from that of other people. So Tisane is quite wrong when he says that science, being objective, must abstract away from subjectivity, consciousness, intentionality, and other features of experience itself. The ambiguity of the words subjective and objective is being exploited. We can be objective, or unbiased, in dealing with subjectivity itself, as well as with the topic of consciousness, intentionality, and other features of the mind. There is no barrier that prevents scientists from formulating and verifying hypotheses about any subject whatsoever. There is no realm in which continental philosophers can roam, but scientists cannot. Thus, it is also misleading of Tisane to say that natural science has eliminated human subjectivity with all of its complexity and detail. This is true for neither sense of the word subjectivity. Scientists can and do study subjectivity in the sense of bias, and they can and do study consciousness. In the latter case, we have knowledge by description that can never amount to knowledge by acquaintance. But it would be absurd to think that a continental philosopher or anyone else can do any better. Tisane uses words like mechanism and machine to give the impression that science falsifies consciousness. It was the dualist Descartes who introduced the idea that animals lacking souls are machines, and that the human body, which allegedly has a soul, is also a machine. But this is simply a misuse of language. Neither a cat nor a human body is a machine, and in the ordinary sense of the word, and no scientist studying consciousness uses the word machine, as Descartes did. Comparisons may be made with machines, for advanced computerized robots can be called machines, but can also have mental attributes, but that is a different matter. Tisane also says that when psychology abstracts from the concrete detail of the mind, we tend to forget some of the detail. This is no more a problem in psychology than it is in any other sphere. We always resort to the abstraction of thought in order to come to grips with the wealth of data revealed to our senses. Psychology does not intend to leave any aspect of the mind out of account. though of course it does aim to record every last concrete detail of each person's mental life. Of course it is true that, as Tieszen says, we had knowledge of the mind before psychology existed. Similarly, we had knowledge of objects before physics existed. The point of science is to extend the knowledge, and in both psychology and physics this has occurred. Tisane is on firmer ground when he says that denial of consciousness exists when he says that the denial that consciousness exists is skepticism gone too far. However, we are dealing here not with the genuine skepticism, but rather with a cynical denial that consciousness exists in order to promote an acceptance of behaviorism, which is geared towards the control of behavior and has no concern for what goes on within an organism. Physiological psychologists, on the other hand, may accept the identity theory, but that does not mean that they are ignoring consciousness. Tisane goes on to grant that one can be objective about subjectivity. Of course we can be objective about subjectivity both within and outside science, but Tisane is hopelessly confused when he imagines that science cannot ascribe intentionality to beliefs. Scientists will not want to use the jargon of continental philosophy, but they will not want to deny any clearly stated truths about consciousness. As for the idea of a priori science of the human consciousness, as envisaged by Husserl, this is nowhere to be seen because we cannot arrive at facts about consciousness without using experience. Tisane says that it is legitimate to ask what it is about the human mind that makes theorizing possible. It is, but that does not settle the question of the type of philosophy that can best handle the question. Analytic philosophy, with its roots in logic, is well suited to identification of the elements on which a capacity to theorize depends. Now, Tisane claims that constructive engagement has occurred between analytic and continental philosophers. Certainly, analytic philosophy has changed in recent decades, and continental philosophy has moved away from the extremes represented by Heidegger and others. But does this amount to anything more than a deterioration in the average quality of analytic philosophy and a change in continental philosophy that leaves it still without much value? Now, I think not, but Tisane does not offer any evidence of substantial achievement resulting from constructive engagement, and his article as a whole is not exactly impressive in that regard. Tisane goes on to quote a Taoist text, which is indeed reminiscent of the extract from Heidegger which is found at the beginning of the article. Presumably, natural science should not be or is not in a position to dismiss such a philosophical text with a lordly wave of the hand, Tisane says. Well, scientists do not consider such text as a rule, but philosophers do, and the verdict should be that Heidegger's obscurantism is not unprecedented. Hitler was not the first ruler who felt a need to shut down serious thinking in the humanities and use philosophy to plunge people into derangement. Tisane even tells us that Heidegger was familiar with Taoist texts and suggests that ancient traditions of thought will help a man achieve a free relationship to the technological world. But this is nonsense. The problem is political. Who controls the development and use of technology? What values are involved? Politics determines what scientific knowledge is and is not acquired, and what use is made of the technology. It should be agreed, though, that reports by subjects about their own minds should be incorporated into psychology, and this is done by many psychologists. Leaving aside some nonsense talked about by Tisane about Buddhism and science, we can agree with the Dalai Lama's statement about psychology, which is an appropriate response to behaviorism. Tisane concludes by asking us to keep science in its proper place. He does not reject science, but says that we need it to cultivate our understanding of the fundamental features of experience that are concealed by the sciences. But science does not conceal anything, although it does not record everything and does not provide knowledge by acquaintance. Nor should we look to the sources that Tisane has in mind if we want enlightenment, like Heidegger, for example. No sensible person believes that we have knowledge only through science. for we have knowledge before science existed, and there is a great deal of knowledge of matters of fact that we will not find in science. For example, a statement that a car is approaching you as you cross the road. Nor will history or logic count as science. So, scientism is actually a red herring.